Hello, my name is Paul Gilbert, and I'm president of the Compassionate Mind Foundation. And today it's an absolute delight, a pleasure, and an honor to have as my guest to talk to Professor Richard Davidson, who's probably one of the most profoundly important researchers in the area of mindfulness and compassion. So we're very honored that Richard is going to be with us to talk about how can we bring compassion into the world. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. Professor Davidson received his PhD from Harvard University in psychology in 1976, 2 years before me, actually. Professor Davidson's research is broadly focused on the neural basis of emotion and emotional style and methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation and related contemplative practices. He has published over 650 articles, numerous chapters and reviews, and edited 17 books. He is the author, with Sharon Begley, of The Emotional Life of Your Brain, published in 2012, which I read and was absolutely fascinated by, and co-authored with Daniel Gorman of Altered States, published in 2017. He was named as one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine in 2006. He was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2017 and appointed to the governing board of UNESCO Manhattan Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development in 2018. In 2014, Professor Davidson founded the nonprofit Healthy Minds Innovation, which translates science into tools to cultivate and measure well-being, which is absolutely extraordinary. Altered States, I thought, was a fascinating book because it introduced some of the history of how Professor Davidson got into the areas of mindfulness. This was a book in 2002, which he wrote, which he edited with Anne Harrington. Again, it's a wonderful book on visions of compassion. So that was all those years ago. And then, of course, there's the Mind Zone Physician, which he edited with John Kabat-Zinn and features a lot of the work of the Dalai Lama. He also was very important in setting up the Mind and Life, which was set up in 1991. This was a group of scientists who came together to study the processes of the contemplative practices and what happens in the brain. And he's been very involved with the Dalai Lama. And of course, Matthew Ricard was the person, and we've spoken to Matthew. He's been on our program. I know Matthew very well. And he was one of the Buddhist monks who's been meditating for many years and allowed Professor Davidson to look at his brain while he was doing that. And we learned a lot from all of that. And he's been incredibly influential in supporting and developing studies in the neuroscience of compassion and mindfulness in the most extraordinary way. So it is, as I say, a great honor to welcome you here, Richie. And I met you some years ago, and it was a wonderful experience. And you've done some wonderful work in the area over many, many years. But how did it all start for you? How did you get interested in mindfulness and compassion?
Well, first, thank you for having me, Paul, and thank you for all you're doing to bring compassion to the world. Um, for me, it really began many, many years ago when I was a graduate student, and I was very fortunate to be around some people whose personal demeanor was infectious to me. They were very kind and compassionate people, and they seemed to radiate with these qualities. And they were not my professors at Harvard. They were folks who were on the fringes. And when I was a graduate student, I went off to India for the first time in the mid 1970s to get a little taste of this myself. And I was quite taken by it and came back from India in 1974 with a fervent aspiration to do research on this as a graduate student. But I was very quickly told by my professors at Harvard that that was a terrible idea, and that I had better find something more mainstream to study. And then for many years, in fact, almost 20 years, I was what I would call a closet meditator. I was meditating in my personal life and finding benefit, but really not connecting my personal practice to my professional work. All that changed in 1992 when I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama challenged me on the first day I met him and asked me a very simple question. He said, "Why can't I use the same tools of neuroscience that I was then using to study negative qualities of human experience, like stress and anxiety and depression, and use those tools to study kindness and to study compassion?" And I didn't have a very good answer for him other than that it's hard. But that was a wake up call for me. And really, that was the turning point. And we began to orient our work toward this area. And I came out of a closet with my interests. And I made a commitment to the Dalai Lama on that day in 1992 that I was going to do everything I could to put compassion squarely within the crosshairs of modern science. And, you know, I think you're one of the people that knows, Paul, that if you go back to the early 1990s and look at textbooks of psychology or neuroscience, I doubt you would find a single textbook with the word compassion mentioned in the index. But now that has changed. And His Holiness's wish that this be a topic approached by more mainstream science, I think, has really occurred. And so I feel very fortunate to have played a small role in helping to nurture that along.
Yes, I'm not so sure it's so small, but yes, and that personal meditation, I think I mean, I got interested, of course, because of the Beatles and the Maharishi and all that sort of thing in the 60s, and I didn't go off to India or anything like that, but I had an interest in the contemplative processes. And that period of time when you were, as you say, a closet mindfulness, what came out for you in terms of understanding the mind and thinking about issues like compassion?
Yeah. Well, as a closet meditator, I said then, and what came out for me was that I was really feeling that I was connecting to something that was core to human nature. That humans are really born to be kind. They're born to have a compassionate disposition, to help relieve the suffering of others. I very much believe, and I think scientific evidence now shows that this really is a propensity that most humans come into the world exhibiting. Now, we can learn all kinds of other qualities that interfere with this, but this is really our basic nature. And I think that for me, the meditation practice has really helped to familiarize myself with this basic nature and to strengthen these qualities that I believe every human being has access to.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, I suppose the thing I'm very interested in, I've become very interested in more recently, is this distinction between what is sometimes called non-duality states, the experience of a type of consciousness where you are part of everything, everything's part of you. There's a dissolving of the sense of self, time and space. I know the physicists are getting interested in that. So that's one dimension by which people begin to experience the importance of compassion. But then there's the biological side, which is the part you're talking about, the evolution of the mechanisms of oxytocin, vagus nerve, and all of that. I suppose the issue that I struggle with a little bit is that that was very much evolved for in-group behavior, and the problem comes in tribal behavior, and that's the big problem in the world. How do we extend compassion across the tribes and try to find some way to inhibit this awful tribal violence?
Yeah. Well, again, I think that if you look at kids before the age of 3, they don't make these tribal distinctions. A toddler before the age of 3 makes absolutely no discrimination based on the color of a person's skin, for example. Um, and young infants are much more likely to show a preference to help um, others who are unrelated to them. And so the tribal instinct that you're talking about is something that we learn. And if we can learn it, we can unlearn it. And of course, part of the practice of compassion meditation is learning to extend our circles of compassion. And so, I think for most people, having compassion toward one's in group is not too difficult. It's something that comes quite naturally. And if we can learn to extend that step by step gradually to a wider range of humanity, I think that's something that we really can do, and research shows that it is a learnable skill. So I think it's really a matter of bringing these practices to a wide range of people and making them more and more accessible.
Yeah, I mean that's fantastic. And within that process of compassion training is this ability to take empathic positions of thinking if that were me, if that were me, like when we think about some of the things going on in the world at the moment, if that was my wife, if that was my children, and how we help people take a position of connectedness to the other as if that were me. And helping compassion grow from that empathic bridging, really. So I mean,
Exactly.
what's your view about that? How we can get people to be much more focused on this empathic connecting to others and to others' suffering?
Yeah, I think it needs to be done gradually. If you asked a person to cultivate compassion toward a member of an extreme outgroup for them, it's not realistic. They're not going to be able to do that. But if we do it very gradually, step by step, I think it can be achieved. So, for example, one of the things that we've shown is that in the US, there is a very big um, achievement gap between Black and white students in academic performance in the K through 12 space. That's a very well-known quote achievement gap. And the achievement gap is driven by implicit bias. Even teachers report on a self-report measure that they're not biased, yet they show implicit bias. They show bias toward members of racial outgroups. And so we've shown that simple compassion training for teachers can actually reduce a hard-nosed behavioral measure of implicit bias. And that reduction in bias can persist. So, we have evidence that you can actually change this and change it toward members of outgroups. But we just need to do this step by step, and it needs to become a lifelong practice. And the analogy that I often use is brushing our teeth. When humans first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And I'll bet every listener to this podcast brushes their teeth at least a few minutes a day. And, when you reflect on it, it's kind of amazing because it's not part of our genome. We've all learned to do this because we accept that it's important for our personal physical hygiene. And what we're talking about is something important for a person's mental hygiene. And the data show that if we spend even as short a time each day as we spend brushing our teeth, cultivating our heart and our mind in this intentional way, this world would be a different place.
Yeah. Now you say a short little practice. I mean, what are the key components of your short practice for compassion that you think people should or would be good for them to practice on a regular basis?
I think that it really doesn't take much. I think bringing a person into their mind and their heart, recognizing that every human being shares the same wish to be happy, to be free of suffering, and envisioning a time in a person's life when they may have had some challenges, and then genuinely cultivating the aspiration that they be relieved from that suffering. And it's not hard to do, particularly if you do it gradually. You can start with loved ones and people in your in-group, and then gradually extend it. Um, but even, people whose behavior is abominable, and who you abhor, you can recognize that their behavior is the product of confusion and delusion, and that they're probably really suffering. And that's an occasion, it's an affordance, if you will, for compassion. You recognize that they're not doing this intentionally. They're doing it because they're deluded and confused. And that can really be enormously beneficial. But that's, further down the road. You can do this just step by step.
Yeah, no, it's a brilliant point you make. I mean, as you know, we've done a lot of studies in the prisons, and one of the things you find with a lot of these individuals is that they're highly traumatized. And underneath that, they really never experience much compassion from others, and they have a very deep seat of isolation and loneliness. And sometimes they feel the only way I can feel safe is if I can frighten you. If I can frighten you, now I feel safe. And how generating compassion for them, for the pain that creates that, I think is a very important process. So the other point I think is the ways in which we are able to have compassion for those people who are, as you say, deluded and confused, and recognizing that part of that is generated because they're very frightened, actually. They've been very hurt in the past, they distrust and they're slightly paranoid. And how we can actually start to generate that ability to recognize that people who cause harm have usually had harm caused to them. I think that's a key
Exactly.
issue,
I
isn't
think
it?
that I totally agree. I think it's a hugely important point. And, modern research shows that people who have had a history of trauma of that kind typically come from families where there's intergenerational trauma,
Yeah, yeah,
and that's transmitted through many different mechanisms. It's transmitted through cultural learning, but it's also transmitted epigenetically.
yeah,
We now know that, and so they're starting off life um, with some scarring, if you will. And so those are people for whom I very much agree with you. One important part of the strategy needs to be to have compassion for them. And when they're treated with respect and with compassion in that way, that really helps to unlock their intrinsic nature and the compassion within themselves.
yeah, that's right. And that's a great, because one of the things that both you and I agree very much on is that, compassion and kindness is okay. But at the center of compassion is this deep courage and wisdom to address suffering, regardless of the cost to a degree, to some extent. So your ability to step into pain, to step in, not away from it, and work out what's going to be. So that issue of developing the courage to engage with suffering, I mean, what's your view about that? I mean, how do you see this process of developing the courage to engage with suffering?
Yeah, I think I would very much appreciate and like how you name it, the courage to step into suffering. And again, I think, Paul, I see it as a gradual process for most people because for some people, the suffering can be very intense, and
Yeah,
stepping into it can be frightening, it can be painful, and it can lead to aversion and have a kind of backfiring effect where they're running away from it rather than stepping into it. And so I think it needs to be done really gradually. Uh, uh, but I do think that if it is done gradually, I think most people are able to eventually get to a place where they can, as you say, have the courage to step into it. That's associated with a whole cascade of biological changes, changes that occur in the brain that we're just beginning to understand. And again, that takes time. to learn and to establish. It's not something that can just happen by fiat. It requires gradual learning.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of what you've done, I mean, I remember, I think you were the first person I heard talk about neuroplasticity, which is you're not just changing psychological process, which you actually have to change some of these neural circuits as well. And that's why this repetition and the ability to kind of bit by bit, as you say, is so important. So your studies on neuroplasticity has been really important. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're seeing that these days?
Yeah, so neuroplasticity has been around way before my time. I may have been the first to link neuroplasticity to contemplative practice, but the study of neuroplasticity is really at the heart of modern neuroscience. And some of the great neuroscientists of the 19th and 20th century really have been um, uh, uh, the founders of the study of neuroplasticity. So, uh, to put it simply, the brain is the organ that's built to change in response to experience more than any other organ. Um, it's wired to to be associative and to change its pattern of connections as a consequence of experience. And that's how experience leads to lasting change, whatever the experience is. And so, one of the things that's important for listeners to keep in mind is that neuroplasticity is neutral with respect to its benefit. It could be beneficial, but it also could be deleterious. If we have neuroplasticity and we're exposed to trauma, that will facilitate the encoding of the trauma and will lead to neuroplastic changes that will have long-term deleterious consequences. And so, so that's something really important to keep in mind. So what we really want to do is to increase neuroplasticity and do it while we are cultivating wholesome qualities of the mind to help consolidate those wholesome qualities so that they lead to consistent change in experience and behavior. What we've also discovered is that when people meditate, whether it's meditating with compassion or other kinds of meditation, intentional cultivation in this way leads to neuroplastic changes. It didn't have to be this way, but it turns out it is. That when we engage in these kinds of intentional practices, our brains actually change. And that's kind of remarkable. They change functionally first, and they may change structurally when there is really long-term practice. And so these changes in the brain are likely to be the substrate that results in these changes enduring. And so, the book that I wrote with Dan Goleman, you slightly misquoted the title. The title is not Altered States, but it's Altered Traits. And that's a very intentional play on words. And I wanted to mention that because altered traits is really what we care about. It's the consistent change that endures, that affects every nook and cranny of our lives. And so with respect to compassion, we can meditate on compassion, but if we're not compassionate when we encounter suffering in the world, then what's the point of the meditation? So when we exhibit changes in our everyday behavior, that's what we call a trait effect, an altered trait. And that's what we really care about. That's what's consequential. And so in order to produce those altered traits, the changes in the brain that are enduring are likely an important substrate for those behavior changes.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a key key issue, and I apologize. You were very
No
compassionate about
problem.
my error. But they can see the book, and it's a fantastic book. So this is very, very important, isn't it? That these traits also that you can develop through the process of regular meditation, but also through the process of determined, intentional, compassionate behavior, whether it's to be friendly or practice being patient or whatever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things that I'm fond of saying is that one size does not fit all, and there are many different ways to cultivate compassion and to change the brain in these ways. And both of them are important, I think. And most people benefit from both. But there are differences among people where certain strategies may be more effective than other strategies. And so we need to take into account those individual variations.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. That's very important. And what's your view about the Sangha, the building compassionate communities where people get a sense that there's not just themselves sitting meditating by themselves, but they are part of because that's one of the things we're very interested in is how we build a sense of community that people can feel part of a compassion movement, as it were.
I think it's hugely important. I think that, in the Buddhist tradition, there's the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. It's one of the three jewels, so to speak, that is considered really important. Um, I think this is an area, Paul, honestly, where there needs to be more research. Based on my personal experience, I have the conviction that community is enormously important. But I also don't think there's a lot of good research that has specifically focused on the added value of community in helping to nurture the kinds of changes that we're describing. Um, but I'm convinced it's important. I know that in many studies that we've done, we've harnessed the power of community to help um, increase the uptake, if you will, of these practices. Having peers that are doing these practices along with you that you can talk to about it and share is really beneficial in sustaining a regular practice.
Yes, that because as you probably know, we did a study called Energizing Compassion where we played energizing music and we got people to think about compassion as a joyful thing, exciting thing to do to bring compassion into the world. Wouldn't that be great? And also for them to make a connection to the fact there are many people in the world who want to bring compassion into the world and feeling part of that community. And data suggests that they found it very helpful. This idea, oh, I'm one with others, and okay, there's some very terrible things, but there's also some wonderful things. And the helping to tune in to the community of the good, as it were, was very, very important to them. So this idea of creating a sense of connectedness to compassion movements and compassion energy is very, very important. But as you say, I don't know a lot of research that's been done on that at the moment.
Yeah.
So that's something that we're kind of interested in. There's some various new technologies where you can build platforms and things like that. So we're exploring that. So how do you see the challenges really? I mean, we have leaders who really are leading us to the dark side, I'm afraid. So how do we deal with this? I mean, because the leaders really are at the moment doing quite a lot of undermining of compassion efforts.
Yeah. Yeah. So we are, I think most people would agree we're living in very challenging times from so many different perspectives. It's kind of the perfect storm of challenges with climate change, with political polarization, divisiveness, with the wars that we currently have today. So it's a really challenging time. I think that for me, what's really calling me is the need to scale um, compassion and other elements of well-being. And I go back to the analogy of brushing our teeth. Somehow humans have been able to learn that. if they can learn to brush their teeth, they can learn to nourish their mind. I think most people agree that their minds are even more important than their teeth. Um, so somehow this needs to be a public health campaign, like something like that, where um, international agencies, governments, health providers all get on board. We in the United States, we had the chief public health officer of the United States is called the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, and I know him quite well. He's a wonderful guy. And last year, he issued an urgent public health advisory on social isolation and loneliness. It was the first time in US history that the chief public health officer issued an advisory of this sort. And he pointed out the public health related consequences of loneliness and social isolation. Loneliness is a greater risk factor for premature mortality than is smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it gets under the skin. It really affects our biology. This is the kind of information which is critical to be out there and part of a major campaign. And so I think that if the right organizations and leaders really got behind this, this can really be a public health movement. And I think that that's one of the best angles to promote this kind of change. Because having good health and a long life is not, a conservative or a progressive issue. Every human being wants that. And so I think that this is something that goes beyond ideology. And we can really get a lot of consensus around this.
I think that's simple. You probably know the work of Julian Abel on the Compassion Project, where they actually he's a physician, end of life physician, and building communities to support people's health, working through general practitioners clinics. So, for example, with depressed people, connecting them up in groups. There was a really interesting study done in Leicester some years ago where a young GP was giving drugs to lots of women on an estate, and she thought, hang on a minute, what am I doing? And so invited all the estate together for a meeting. They said, look, you're all on the estate, many of you are single parents, you're all struggling, do you meet each other much? No. Okay, so we're going to set up a forum, so you're going to meet, this estate is going to meet every week, and you're going to discuss your problems. And within a few months, Prozac went right down, depression went right. So the
Oh, that's great.
facilitation of community,
Yeah, I love that.
yeah, it's so crucial, isn't it, really? And how do we do
Yeah,
that? That has to be seen as a compassion project too, really. So I'm interested in your
absolutely.
thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. And it's a great example. There's the example of Experience Corps here in the United States where grandmothers from low-income communities were recruited to volunteer in local schools. Uh, and, it gave them a community, gave them a sense of purpose,
Yeah,
put them in touch with their neighbors that they really didn't know. They were engaged in a compassionate action, and it actually had enormous benefits for their mental and physical health. It even changed the brain. It increased their neuroplasticity in beneficial ways.
yeah, yeah, it's fantastic. Yes, because that's right. The point that you're making, and it's in your program, which we'll have a look at in a moment, is that meditation is very, very important, but it also is about action, working with communities. Compassion is more than just, working with our own minds. It's also facilitating communication. It's facilitating people having a sense of purpose, as you say, feeling they can make a contribution. I mean, when I was a young training clinical psychologist working with elderly people, one of the things nearly all of the depressed people say, who needs me? I'm just sitting here waiting to die. I'm of no use to anybody. That sense of actually having no use to anybody, not mattering to anybody, I think is so important. And that is part of a compassion desire for people to feel valued, to people feel included,
Exactly.
people able to offer something, not just to be cared for, but that they can be caring, you know.
Absolutely. And every human being has that potential, I believe. We
Yeah,
just need to harness their innate capacity.
that's right. So one of the things we're interested in is how do you get communities to start thinking about this stuff and working with creating caring and sharing, because you probably know from our point of view, there's two basic strategies. One is control and hold. That's a basic primate strategy. Most primates, Robert Sapolsky's done a lot of work on this. It's all about dominance and getting into power and then just making life very difficult for those below you. But then we evolved in hunter-gatherers and we developed a care and share way of living. And that care share has been phenomenally important for driving social intelligence and so on. But those two are always battling with each other. There's those that want to hold on to their resources and not share, and those that do. So trying to facilitate this care share psychology, I think, is really really crucial. One of the things I also would like to introduce you to with Professor David's work is he's got this fantastic, and he's been working on it for some years, program called the Healthy Minds Program. And you can go onto the internet and you can find this program. And he has got 4 dimensions to it, which is awareness, which is to be present and train your mind in the here and now, and so on. Insight, compassion is one of the crucial dimensions of this program, and also purpose. And if you go onto this site, you can have a number of practices to take you through some of the meditations that Professor David's been talking about, and also you get a Healthy Minds report. So it's absolutely wonderful. And it's free, it's donation. Obviously, all donations are really gratefully received to facilitate this work. But do go and have a look at this because it is really, really, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. How that program came about, how you're doing with it, and where you want to see it going.
Yeah, thank you so much for introducing it, Paul. So we published a paper in 2020 called The Plasticity of Well-Being. And the subtitle was a training-based framework for the cultivation of human flourishing. And in this paper, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, we provided um, uh, 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 a review of these 4 key elements of human flourishing: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose, that were supported by hard-nosed neuroscientific research and also had a parallel in the contemplative tradition. So we wanted to find that overlap in the Venn diagrams, if you will, of frameworks developed in contemplative traditions, frameworks developed in Western science. What's the overlap? And the overlap is these 4 pillars. And one of the things you will note is that um, among these 4 pillars, 2 of them are found in most other Western psychological conceptions of well-being. The 2 that are found in others are connection, which would include compassion, and purpose. And there are 2 components that are not found in any other Western scientific framework for well-being, and that is insight and awareness. And together, these represent what we believe are the necessary and sufficient conditions for human flourishing. And there are specific practices to cultivate each of these, and we've put that all into a curriculum, and we've made it freely available. We started a nonprofit in 2014 called Healthy Minds Innovations that's affiliated with our university center. And the main product that is offered by this nonprofit is this Healthy Minds program. And we put it into the form of an app. And at the beginning of COVID, we made the preposterous decision that we were going to freely release this. We had no idea how we were going to fund this. And honestly, it's been a challenge, but we made that decision and we're going to stick to it. And so it's totally free. There's no paywall whatsoever. And it's available throughout the world. So unfortunately, it's only available in the English language right now, but we hope to have it translated in the near future. But we've put literally $0 into advertising. We now have over 1 million people who have downloaded it, and we have hundreds of thousands of active users. The New York Times Wirecutter named it as one of the 3 best meditation apps for 3 years in a row, and we've gotten recognition from many other places. And so we're quite pleased with the response. And most important is that people are reporting that it's actually helping them. But the cool thing is we also have done several randomized controlled trials with this, and we've published them. And so this is really the only truly evidence-based program of its kind that I know of. And those randomized trials are out there. We have several others that are in the works that support and extend the findings that we already have. And so this is one way that we're trying to scale this kind of skill-based learning by making it widely available. And we're working with particular sectors now to bring this program to those sectors. One of them is education, the other is healthcare. Those are 2 big sectors in our societies, both of which are suffering. In the United States, teachers in the K through 12 space are really not doing well. 50% of teachers have significant symptoms of anxiety and depression. And healthcare providers are also really suffering. They're reporting very high levels of burnout. And in the US today, there's more than 1 physician suicide every day in the United States. So it's a crisis. And nothing that has really been directed toward these 2 sectors has really worked. And so both of these sectors, we believe, will respond well to the evidence-based approach that we're offering. And we're trying to scale it in these sectors. And if we're successful, these sectors represent big swaths of humanity, and they also serve many others. So any teacher has, typically a couple of hundred students that he or she teaches. And we actually now have data. We haven't yet published this. This is in the works. It will be submitted for publication soon. But we have kind of a holy grail finding, which we've been interested in examining for a long time. We finally had the opportunity to. And that is, in a randomized controlled trial, teachers who are assigned to our well-being training, we examine the academic performance of their students. And their students do significantly better, including on standardized test scores. And this is in a randomized controlled trial with sample sizes over 10,000. So we're super excited about this. And this demonstrates the distal consequences that really matter, that we think will be enormously influential in helping us reach this tipping point where everyone agrees that this is something that needs to be part of their organization.
Absolutely, very much so. Not only, as you would say, teachers, but in many working situations. And we've got a big trial going on in Portugal, as you might know, and we're looking at epigenetic changes associated with compassion training and so on. I mean, it's quite, as you say, it's quite profound. If you hit these evolved motivational systems that have evolved with these physiological systems, with these genes for oxytocin and all the rest of it, if you can hit these systems because they're wired in, then they can start to produce change. So we're not hitting systems that aren't there. We're trying to hit systems that
Exactly.
aren't,
Exactly. And that's that I strongly agree with that. And that's such an important point. So I'm very happy you emphasize that.
Yeah, that's great. So, and taking this program into the workplace and other places, I mean, one of the things I suppose I'm interested in is, that one of the reasons that people get into all of this stress and strife is because of the competitive system. Now, the competitive system is, of course, hundreds of millions of years old, but it really does cause a lot of trouble. And when people get caught up in that and then they start feeling inferior and no good and they're not up to it and all that, that's when they start to go down. And compassion can really help in turning that competitive system off because it is an alternative motivational process. I mean, do you find that a lot with the people that you're trying to help, those who've got stressed and so forth, that they really got sort of caught up in feeling isolated, lonely, and inferior in one way or another?
Yeah, I think that that's a huge issue, and this is why, I think the compassion training needs to be paired with related contemplative training in these other pillars, particularly insight.
Yeah,
When the Dalai Lama, for example, talks about the two wings that are critical, it's compassion and wisdom. Um, but one without the other is unbalanced.
yeah,
And so when we have feelings or thoughts of inferiority and competition, it's the wisdom element which can be enormously helpful there. Having people recognize that this is part of the narrative that they're generating, and the narrative is not who they are, it's just a narrative. It's just thoughts. And when they can see those thoughts as thoughts, they don't get hijacked by them in the same way. And so compassion helps to change the narrative. But before the narrative changes, it's going to do its thing, and there'll be lots of negative thoughts of the sort that you're describing. And we need another kind of strategy to learn to change our relationship to those thoughts. And that's where insight really is important.
yeah, yeah. That's, I mean, I had a talk with the Dalai Lama in Australia some years ago. Because he said, "What are you interested in?" I said, "I'm interested in how do you stop the dark side of humanity," and he was very interested in that and said, "There's a lot in Indian psychology, which the West has actually ignored. That a lot of compassion isn't just about happiness; it is actually about the poisons, what they call the poisons, the harmful side of the mind, and so forth." And that harmful side can also be harmful to ourselves because we get caught up in this sense of an inferior self and so on and so on. The key issue then is how we help people who've got caught up in that and how your program can help people who've got caught up in this way of thinking. I mean, the way that we explain it is that, you've got an evolved brain that's all being designed by evolution, not by you. It's not your fault. But if you could work out how the damn thing works, that could be quite useful. All these programs in your mind, anger, anxiety, they're all programs. They're all developed by, they're all got these neural systems. So learning to become mindful of what program has been triggered and how it's been triggered. So your program, I think, is extremely important for that because, as you say, insight and awareness, those two things become insight into what it is. Where did your brain come from? What's it designed to do? It's designed to survive and reproduce. That's what it's designed to do. It's not designed to be happy, particularly. That insight is crucial. And then you bring this compassion to that, because none of us chose to have a brain like this. That's it. So those four pillars, I think, go together very well with an evolutionary framework, actually.
Yeah, no, I would very much agree. And I think that the way you're describing it is really important and is part of the strategy that we use in how we offer this. The program, as we currently have it out there, includes not just meditation practices, but it also includes these mini podcasts. You can think of them as sort of little science learnings, and that's a kind of declarative learning where people are learning what the science says about this, and then they're offered practices, which are the procedural learning to help really embody them. So both are really crucial elements.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So I mean, the hour's gone very, very quickly. So let's move to the future. How would you like to see your work developing and indeed the work of mindfulness and compassion? What is your hopes for how it can develop?
Well, one dream that we have is to bring this at scale to a modest sized city. and have a flourishing city where 6 major sectors of the city are all engaged in this kind of program simultaneously: city government, education, healthcare, communities of faith, first responders, and the workplace. We had those 6 sectors all doing this program together, or some variant of it. Um, uh, uh, this would be the talk of the city. It'd be on billboards. Train your mind, change the world. And if we're able to do this in a modest sized city, say 1 million, we can actually look at distal outcomes that matter. What's the life expectancy? What's the suicide rate? What's the substance abuse? How much money are we spending on healthcare costs? These are all metrics that can be tracked. What's the crime rate? These are all metrics that we think will be influenced. And we think this is really doable.
Yeah.
And if we're really able to show this at that kind of scale, that will be a game changer.
A game changer is an understatement, isn't it, really? And the point that we've been talking about through the hour is that these changes in change, understand and work with your brain, they're not in isolation, because they will also change how you behave in your communities, right? So this is
Absolutely.
such an
How you
important thing.
behave with your spouse, how
Yeah,
you behave with, the people you work with,
yeah,
all of that.
yeah.
And
So
that's what an altered trait is.
yes, yes. So it becomes not just something in one's own mind, but it comes is something in the sharing of minds, the way minds are sharing and
Absolutely.
communicating and stimulating each other, the things are stimulating in each other. So it's a fabulous dream. I mean, how far are you away from achieving it?
Honestly, I don't know. I think it's very nonlinear. I think that I've been talking about it to a number of influential people, so we'll see. I think it's gonna. Um, I'm. I have the conviction that it will happen within the next couple of years.
Wow, wow, wow. Wow, wow. So I mean, the point is you've done the hard graft, you've got the training, you've got the neuroscience, you've got the programs. I mean, you've done,
And
just
we've worked with each of those sectors individually.
yeah, wow, yeah,
And we've published with many of them. We've published with police, with firefighters, with teachers, with healthcare providers, and with employees in the workplace. So, we've worked with those sectors individually. We've never worked with them all together, though. And that's going to create a synergistic impact, I think.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. And of course that's very interesting what happens when people share these values and like this idea that we are stimulating each other's brains in our interactions, just a smile, a voice
Exactly.
tone. And so you're producing not just changes through meditation, but changes through in the ways we're interacting with the minds of others. Yeah.
Exactly. And so ordinary people would understand that when they, smile and
Yeah.
say hello to a stranger, it actually is affecting their each other's brains.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So we have that as a little practice for some of our depressed folk, actually, and say, go on the street and smile and see how many people you can get to smile back at you. Okay. Because when you
yeah,
do that, you've given them a little dopamine buzz, but you'll also get a little dopamine buzz too. My wife and I used to have this competition on a Sunday. We used to walk by a river and we'd use our facial expressions and flash our eyebrows, and we'd have a competition to see how many people we would get to say hello. But it was a great fun game. But there's more than a game, because it is an example of the stimulation that people want to be recognized. They want to be in communication, and most people prefer
exactly.
to be in friendly communication than hostile communication.
Exactly. Exactly. It feels good.
Yeah, it feels good. So, coming to the end, Richie, is there anything that you'd like to kind of focus on?
Well, I would just end by saying, going back to a theme that I introduced several times earlier, and that is that I think for real change to occur, we need to approach it step by step, gradually. And if we each made a commitment to do a few minutes a day, of this kind of intentional practice, this will really have profound influence on others, on our own social ecologies, and on the world. And so I simply invite all of the listeners to join us in this, what really is a movement, because the world needs it more today than it's ever needed it before.
I yeah, absolutely couldn't agree. And I don't think it's because we're any more aggressive or not. It's just that with the means we have of being aggressive, right? The weapons we have now, oh dear, oh dear. If we don't get control over this stuff, then we are in, well, we already are in serious trouble. I was reading a horrible thing the other day about Android wars, developing robot armies and stuff like that. It is actually quite scary. So I think what you're saying is so important. It's a Star Wars thing, isn't it? Beware the dark side. But the key issue
Yeah,
is this: how do you address it? Well, firstly, working with your own mind and working with the dark side of your own mind, and so that you can then begin to bring this compassion into the world, and then how you can influence organizations and this, groups around you.
absolutely. Our minds are really the only thing we can control.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And the other last point to share with you, what's your view about this movement now into this non-duality awareness and using mindfulness not necessarily just to regulate or affect systems in the brain, but to create brain states that can have these in what are called enlightened or breakthrough experiences?
Yeah, I mean, my own practice, my own meditation practice is very much a non-dual kind of practice. I've been practicing in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition for many years, and so I'm intimately familiar with the practices experientially, as well as the little that's been done scientifically. I think that they're, extremely important, and I think that uh, they are uh, they can be quite accessible to people if they're taught in the right way. Um, and so I think that these are the kind of practices that can really help with familiarizing ourselves with the fact that we are genuinely interdependent, that we're not these isolated creatures acting independently, that that's really an illusion. Uh, and um, and so the more I think we can experientially grasp that, I think that will really help in changing people's behavior.
Very much so. And I mean, Donald Hoffman talks about this as a headset, there's in this field of consciousness and so forth. So I think the point is that compassion is the future. I think it's the most courageous and wise of all of our motivation. There is no motivation more courageous and wise than compassion. It is the one that will address suffering because it wants to do that in whatever way. And you have been a fabulous, wonderful contributor to the science and how to do it. So, Richard Davidson, Professor Davidson, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon in this fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for all you're doing to bring compassion to the world.